Good afternoon, everybody. It's nice. I hope you've had a good lunch. Please take some extra fruit salad if you want. There's still lunch left over. It's good to see even more faces than this morning. So lucky you, those who had a rest this morning. But for you, because we've had a nice morning with Adnan El Khali from Tunisia and with Miguel de Moragas from Spain. And now we're moving into the third keynote presentation of today, and which will be followed by our workshops in the afternoon after a break. But I'm happy to introduce our next speaker, who is Alfonso Gumucio-Dagron, who in the program is presented as a writer, a researcher, and a filmmaker. And maybe one could add many other, I think, professions to his career. Alfonso has a long career behind him in Latin American communication for development and social change. I would say both research and practice, and very many ways of expressing yourself as a poet, as a film producer, as a writer of both fiction and many debate articles and research. So I'm happy that Alfonso has come all the way from Bolivia, where he lives now and is from, to talk to us about some of the community film experiences from Latin America under the title of, that's the title of your presentation, Indigenous Film, Memory and Public Sphere in Latin America. So welcome, Alfonso.
Thank you. Maybe we can just turn off the lights because we're going to be looking at the screen the whole time. Okay, thank you. Okay, so we have 1 hour, less than 1 hour, because we want some questions and remarks and things like that. So I'm going to open 7 doors, and if we don't open all of them, if we don't reach the magic number, it doesn't matter much. These are the doors, quickly put there, and I would like to start saying that who I am, why I'm here. I'm a kind of a hybrid person because I come from cinema, literature. I started as a writer, then cinema was something that I enjoy doing and of course seeing. Then I entered into the field of communication and some research on communication. Actually, during my first exile, political exile in France, I did study filmmaking in what was at the time one of the best schools in Europe. But this is interesting because when I came back to Bolivia, there was no film industry. So I had to unlearn many things that I had learned and start again from the bottom to see what could I do in terms of film. So I started in Bolivia with a small organization called CIPCA, which worked with peasants and workers. And we started with Super 8 cameras and small documentary films on the reality of peasants in my country. This led, obviously, to some work as a consultant. I started as an international consultant. Wow, we're going to have that all the time. Okay. As an international consultant, working in programs and projects of communication for development. On my second exile, which was in 1980, I worked in Nicaragua with UNDP, the United Nations. Then I came back to Bolivia and started a new organization called CIMCA, the Center of Integration of Alternative Media, and also worked with UNICEF in Africa and Haiti during 7 years. Then came the Communication for Social Change Consortium. You might have heard about it. And that was a period of time where we did a lot of things, and we kind of positioned the term communication for social change. I will go in detail after that, after a while on these things. Until very recently, I've been the coordinator of the thematic group on communication for social change in ALAIC, which is the Latin American Association of Communication Research. And I'm now contributing to the master's degrees in several universities in Latin America, like Uniminuto and Santo Tomás in Colombia, also in Guatemala. And since I came back to Bolivia after many years, a few months ago, I joined the IPCOM, which is the Institute of Postgraduates and Research in Communication. All this to say that I started very much as a practical person, doing films, working with peasants and workers, and this led to reflecting on what I was doing, and this reflection led to some theory, although I do not consider myself someone that really is a theoretician in any way. What I have done really in my life is ask questions. And if you look at my films or my books, most of them are the result of the questions I kind of try to respond. For example, my latest film is a film I did in India, and the previous ones, which I will just put here, are films that were the beginning of why I did these films, is saying, how do these people do communication? How do they communicate? And how do they build their own processes of communication? So in India, I was following a group of Dalit women that they work with video. They do video on their own reality. Previously in Guatemala, in Colombia, I followed the river Magdalena, which is a war zone. It's a very difficult zone in Colombia, visiting about 6 or 7 community radio stations that were working in those difficult circumstances, so I documented that work. Before that, I was in Nicaragua with a very interesting radio station which is called La Primerísima. Previously, I did, this was different, this was on union rights in Bolivia. This was a series of documentaries that were aired by the Dutch television in 1988. And before that, I did a film for UNESCO, which is called Voices from the Mines, which is based on one of the most emblematic and old experiences of community radio in the world, which is the miners' radio stations of Bolivia, which we feel very proud about, and we think that experience really started many other experiences worldwide. And this is another film I did, which is actually the first film I did when I graduated from France, which is kind of a historical film on military coups in my country, in Bolivia, since the beginning of last century. Same thing for the books. I've been asking questions and trying to respond them. For example, if the computer allows me to show you. You know, computers also think, so sometimes they take time to. They are not perfect. Wow. Reflecting, asking questions. Let's see if it comes. Anyway, I will start talking. For example, I asked myself about censorship, because I've been also under censorship and exile in Latin America as a filmmaker, and I started asking my friends how they lived through this experience, and that came out as a book which is called film censorship and exile in Latin America. That was one of my my books. I hope this thing is not going to stay like that all the time. Otherwise, I'm gonna. Okay. Another book. We were asking ourselves about experiences of communication and development, participatory communication for social change, and this came out as a book that is called Making Waves. Some of you might know. If you don't, it's available online. You can just download it for free. And then with Thomas, we did this small book here, which is only 1,400 pages. This is the packet book. There's another edition with wheels that will come soon. Actually, we did first the English version, which is a little bit smaller, and then the Spanish version, which is, I consider, much better. And the last thing, which I'm going to talk about now.
Where's the presentation?
It crashed, huh? Never trust technology. So the last book, the last question I kind of posed to myself is what's happening with the community film in Latin America and the Caribbean. And this is the result. This is the last book actually I did last year, and it was published in Cuba and Venezuela. And this is what I will talk about now. Just one more, yeah, I can go ahead. Okay, so hopefully this will not crash again. So these are the books. My first book actually was a book called Provocaciones. I was a young writer and I said, why do we write? Why do writers write? You know, so I started having conversations with 14 Bolivian writers, and that was my first book very, very long time ago. Then, as I was going to be a filmmaker, I said, well, who has done films in Bolivia before, and why? And I wrote, just asking those questions, I wrote the first history of the Bolivian cinema. And I did the same questions for Latin America, so I did a larger book. I'm kind of specializing in very heavy books on the filmmaking in Latin America. Then I asked myself about Bolivia, my country. What does it mean to be a Bolivian, and what's my country like? So I wrote another thing. Then the one I show you, Making Waves, Communication for Social Change with Tomás, and Cine Comunitario in America Latina. So that's the first door, and that has taken already like 15 minutes, so let's go. So I'm going to be a little bit descriptive here, because this is what we did in this research program with the acronym you see there. It's the Fundación del Nuevo Cine Latinoamericano, Foundation of the New Latin American Cinema, which is, the president is Gabriel Garcia Marquez, the Nobel Prize, and the headquarters are in Cuba. And actually they asked me to conduct this, to coordinate this study, initially on 6 countries, but we said, well, 6 countries is not enough, let's do 14, and we did it with the same money. We didn't have more money for that, but we did it. And the idea was to include, when we said community film in Latin America, to include all kinds of communities of interest, not just geographically based communities or ethnic communities. We wanted to look not just at the films. We were not that much interested at the films themselves, but at the process of organization that led to produce those films. And one of the objectives was to fit into the national policies. I mean, in Latin America, there's not much policies on film, and if there is, it's mostly to support commercial film and not film done by communities. Though that kind of cinema is almost ignored. So it's important that it was important for this research to have a little bit of the context of media legislation in Latin America. I don't know how much do you know about, but recently, in the past 2 or 3 years, several countries like Argentina, Ecuador, Uruguay, Venezuela have enacted new legislation dealing with media and communication in general, which has, in fact, raised a lot of protests from the private sector that doesn't want to have any type of legislation to control. And so that was something that we needed to take into consideration. So we wanted, the objective of this research was first to document the experiences. Nobody knew about them. We knew that the communities were producing films on themselves, but there was no real documentation on that. We wanted to build kind of a regional qualitative landscape, and I emphasize qualitative because we were not interested into the quantity of films they were making, or if they were 30-minute films or an hour films or whatever, but just the movements, the groups, the social entities that were producing these films. And this with the objective, of course, of facilitating some kind of regional networking, facilitating them to meet. That was important, to have conversations, dialogues, influence policy making. I already mentioned this before. And then to socialize the information, which means to distribute the information, which I am doing now, for example, or we did through the book. We had to limit the scope of the research. We didn't have enough time or funding. So we decided that this was the main thing. We are going to look only at those experiences that are led by the communities themselves. I mean, there's a lot of films that are made by filmmakers that go into communities and film with or on the communities, but in this case we wanted the communities filming themselves. That was the first thing that we decided. We wanted also to report on processes of production, distribution, etc., that will where the community was the center, where there was a cultural, social, political value that was important for the community. Then we wanted to look at all kinds of forms of organization, the diversity of forms of organization in the communities. We said, okay, we are going to look at anything that is documentary, fiction, or animation. We don't have any, we said, well, any moving image for us is film, okay, because, you know, we started with the 35 millimeter, 16 millimeter Super 8, then came video in 4 or 5 formats, then we have digital. But for us, when we say cinema or we say film, we are talking about moving images. That's the point, not the technology itself that is being used. And we wanted to look also at the distribution of these films, either at the community level or commercial level, which is really not very common, but in some cases we saw that. And this is another thing that is important. We wanted to cover with this research a period of time that is recent, from the year 2000 until now, and to include experiences that had at least 3-4 years of existence, just to be able to evaluate a little bit how far they went, how they did, and that's what we... So the main activities of this research, it's... Oh gosh, come on, move. Where's my friend? Yeah, crashed again or something. It's not moving. Anyway, The main activities, we had first a meeting in Havana, in Cuba, with 6 researchers, because I coordinated a group of 6 researchers. We couldn't have a researcher for each country because of, I mentioned the limits of time and funding. So each researcher kind of took 3 countries. That was the deal. The one that the Argentinian researcher took Paraguay and Uruguay, the one in Ecuador took also Venezuela and Colombia, and so on. And we managed to cover the 14 countries, as I said before. That was the first step. We defined in this meeting what we wanted, the kind of questions we were going to ask, the methodology of the review.
Just keep on talking.
Yeah, keep on talking, yeah, but I need my reference. So, okay, don't worry, I can handle from here then. Okay. So design a methodology. We then had a period of gathering the existing information. We contacted hundreds of groups that were active, and then our researchers went to visit the group that we had selected, which are basically 55 groups in the book that must be circulating someplace. And then the researchers did their country report. We discussed that, and then we got to the publishing of the book. We have launched the book in several festivals. Last year in the festival in Havana, this year in the festival in Guadalajara in Mexico, and we are planning now a second phase. Those are just the information. I have to insist that we are looking at processes more than products. So we were very interested in community organization for audiovisual production. We were looking at the debates and conversations that came around on film documenting. What happened about social networks, if these communities were building social networks, the real social networks. I'm not talking about the internet social networks. We were looking at how they were strengthening individually and collectively their memories and their identities, and if this activity of doing films and creating these production groups was contributing in some ways to local democracy, participation, etc. Social, cultural, and political empowerment. And what we got actually is interesting, because the first thing we notice is that all these groups do film not because it's a fancy thing to do, etc., because they just want their voices to be heard, and they took the chance with the video, or very few with Super 8, but basically the most recent ones with video or digital. And they really claim it's a way, it's their right to communicate, to show what they are, to show their problems, their relations, their culture, their traditions. So that was something that came out very clear from the research. Again, the process versus messages. Sometimes the films are not even finished, but the process of doing the film in a community has already changed something in the community, which is something very, very important for them. What came out very clear also is the long-term perspective versus the short-term perspective. It's not just about doing a film, and we will have 5 weeks of shooting and then 5 weeks of editing and then showing the film. No, for them it can take 3 or 4 years to do a film, because the mindset is different. It's not on the commercial side. It's more like, what is that really we want to do with this film? What is that we want to show? What does it mean to discuss the subject of the film with the elders or whatever? I mean, there's a lot of implications that we will look now. We found lots of specificity in the language and format. They don't care if it's 25 minutes television time or 52 minutes television time. No, sometimes the films are 4 minutes or 10 minutes or 50 minutes or 3 hours. It's them that they decide that. So they are completely out of this straitjacket of commercial distribution. And another thing that is interesting is that they don't hide the act of filming. You very often see in their films the cameras, other cameras. They are not saying, oh, that microphone or that camera entered the image. No, they don't care about that because they are not hiding the fact that they are doing a film. And that was also very interesting. And this is something that we will also discuss is the difference between access, participation, and ownership. I mean, they were used, maybe, some of them, of these communities, to have access to tools, audiovisual tools, which means they participated in some projects, etc. But then they build the capacity to participate, which means to make decisions about what they were going to film. It was not just that they were accessory or they were part of another project. They were really the ones that decided, that had ownership of their own project, and this is something that is very important. Deciding their own agenda. And all this is related to memory development and political participation, as we will see when we discuss impact and other things. So what we saw is that in the communities, urban or rural, that had been through a process of several years of doing these films, there was a strengthening of organizations, internal organizations of the community, because the fact that they were doing something that was new for the community meant that they had to discuss these things. It was not just bringing a camera and shooting. It was negotiating. We are going to do this film that is going to, it's an intervention on the whole community, and even if this was the young people normally of the community, they had to discuss with the elders that very often were not inclined to accept that at the beginning. So the relation between communication, culture, and organization came out very clear in this research. How these films contributed to reconstruct social fabric that was very often broken, it's interesting. I think previously in the book Making Waves that is circulating there, I had a couple of examples already on the Kayapo Indians, for example, in Brazil, that when they started doing video, they had lost already many of their cultural traits. They were kind of dispersed. They had not a very strong organization. Then suddenly they started looking at themselves, looking at their past, talking with the elders, and they became quite strong in terms of their capacity and agency to negotiate with the Brazilian government, for example, on the projects that were affecting their lands, etc. So that was kind of common to many of the experiences. Strengthening their cultural identities. Again, this rebuilding of memories. Memories is something that if they have lost in many ways, they have hidden in many ways, they were not proud of in many ways, and suddenly they became to put the pieces together and to rebuild this memory collectively. I mean, each one bringing something up that like in a puzzle, begins to put the picture together, and that was quite important. And participation in the decision-making and policies within the community and the community towards the government or any other institution. So they use this as a tool for social, cultural, economic development. That was very clear in all the process that we saw. Let's see.
Are you going to screen a film?
Yeah.
The slide. The thing is,
is a Mac Windows issue. But I think if you you can play them from the desktop here.
Yeah, but I'm not sure we are there already.
All right. Then is it on these?
It was playing before when we did the test anyway.
This good?
Yeah,
Okay.
let's go back to them.
Right, but I don't know which of these could be any one of those, huh?
Okay, let's
Let's go down. We came to 3.
see, I think, yeah.
Yeah.
Let's try. Yeah, no, we are not in the film yet, so we can just continue there.
Whatever. Okay.
Okay, let's go. So this is we had, as I said, 55 experiences that in the 14 countries that we selected. In Argentina, for example, there's 6. The one I would like to mention is Barricada TV, which is a television station that is functioning in a old factory that was taken by the workers, and they gave some space to this group of Barricada TV. But there's other experiences that deal with the television, with the video production, with training also, and distribution of films. This is Barricada TV. In Bolivia, it's one of the most interesting cases, not because it's my country, but because there has more tradition. CEFREC, the Center of Training in Film, is actually now being part of a larger, much larger government project that includes this plurinational system of communication. So they are producing things for the national television, they are training people from community television in various places. So all of these are very much integrated into one thing now. But the origin is CEFREC. In Brazil, of course, and that's the clips. All the clips that I will show now are from the video Nas Aldeias, which is the most. It has 25 years of working. It's a very interesting experience working in different 12 or 14 different indigenous communities in Brazil, where after a period of training, the communities themselves have been doing their films. And in Central America, there are various interesting things, but one of them is, for example, El Centro de Mujeres Comunicadores Mayas, which is a Mayan woman doing the films on their own reality. Chile, there's the Mapuche Indians. It's true that most of well, it depends on the countries, but most of the most interesting experiences that we gather in the book are from rural communities, indigenous communities. That was outstanding. In Colombia, for example, El Tejido de Comunicación, these are the NASA Indians in El Cauca, in the region of El Cauca, are very, very active. They have an enormous influence. In Cuba, this is Televisión Serrana is the most interesting experience. That they have been like 20-something years also filming in small villages and teaching how to film, so the villagers will film themselves. Ecuador, I go fast because we are Paraguay, Peru. So we cover basically most of the countries in Latin America, and that's the book you just saw. So now we are going to see a small clip, hopefully. Oh, okay, it's working. Sound. It's not under, it has no subtitles, but it's only 4 minutes. Basically, this is the title says, people struggle, but they eat fruits. And the whole thing is about logging. It's companies that are really tearing down the woods, and there's less room for the indigenous populations to be there. These are just clips, but it's interesting to see how they handle cameras, how they, what is the attractive attention when they film.
Kimidanao agaronyak andakiri ronyak andawairenz ashipambirenz. Kimidanao kombiro ashipane yopo amdawonz osheki pangirenz agandakiri. Pathalenda bapayans patari escola mal. Mas puanender pat chokyang maimbani pat per tikat ari kamer nai pang tiri idari gapat puaki.
Ele tá pra ser, rapaz.
Ele tá jangai mal.
Senge do mal nya piai. Kemi chaga. Abesi nya pai tsme pan chocho ha pai ni puka ta pai de hatsi. Pan je handa. Bukan ai handa. Ia ka amina pai ari ani dia ka tonga ele ka hatsi. Que dá de porra
Começando aqui por dentro da nossa terra, a gente identificou duas invasões muito grandes que aconteceram na nossa terra.
So they have a territory that they have to take care of because
começaram aqui, ó.
people that are
Então aqui
companies
não tem
that are
mais
cutting
madeira,
down the
acabou
woods
tudo
are
e eles estão
entering.
começando a chegar dentro da nossa terra.
So those are the camps that the logging companies
Rio
usually
Branco
build.
é amônia. Está saindo uma equipe aqui de 30 achanenca a uma porta de entrada dos invasores.
Kanta 1993, como te caçanag tsmer, te caçanag yoka chega em cima, eu tá mandar atacando yoka achaga plano de manejo, a desmandar achaga yoka. A desmandar o chega one hour.
So the army helps them to take care of the territory, but even then it's very difficult to control the people that cut the trees.
Só a danag dias, a caminhada, mano. Iratsumaya, punhadari, ensi, tensi, kemi, hiroka, inhansi, kura tanjari kamet, kura tanjari, amineri kamet, hiroka, amtawaya shari.
Como nós fala, aqui é assim. A vida é essa. A gente luta, mas tem frutos.
So this was done by the community of Ashanika, as you can read. So all these experiences of community film have really helped to advance. Oh, shit.
Push restart, and then it should be,
Wait.
should be up. I don't know. Have a break. Wait just about Just program blocking it.
Yeah. So there's a lot of material here to think about what we do as communicators, and what I will now start telling you is, once I have already described the kind of work we did, is some questions that relate to our work as communicators and our ideas and concepts about communication. Because these indigenous film practices help us to rethink even the orientation of the academic studies. How to name things is very important. I'm going to discuss this with you right now. because they are using film as a means for social justice. They are using film as a tool for rebuilding their memory. They are using film to reaffirm tradition, creativity, and to relate with other cultures in Latin America. In Brazil, for example, is incredible the ways they have communicated after they started with this kind of films. I always think, and this research has kind of ratified my ideas about this, about the confusing terms. We very often confuse information and communication, for example. We very often confuse journalists and communicators. Very often access and participation, I already mentioned that. Messages and processes. Data and knowledge. Communication and, this is very much in English, communication and communications with S. Sometimes as a faculty of communications. Do they build roads, or, you know, it's some kind of knowledge and knowledges. And this is, we don't have time to enter into a big discussion on this, but I usually go back to the Latin of communication, which is share, to participate, to have something in common, and not just to inform, which is information. So this is something that is very clear for the people that are working in these film groups all over Latin America, although they might not have an academic training. They are very clear about the use of communication tools to participate, to share their values, to share their problems also. And this is on communications, just for, I usually use this with the English-speaking audiences. When we use the plural of communication, is a system as of telephones for communicating, or a system of routes for moving troops, supplies, vehicles, personnel, etc., etc. So, whereas the communication without S is the human fact of communicating, and that I think it's important. I wrote many years ago an article called the New Communicator, where I try to make the difference between us as journalists, I'm a journalist also, and the role that we should have as communicators, which is the role I think have these groups in the communities. They are not acting as journalists at all. They are acting as communicators. They are facilitators of communication in their villages or in their neighborhoods. The title of this Lemons and Tangerines comes from a short essay I published 3 or 4 years ago in Mexico in a journal called Etc., where basically I was trying to redefine the profile of a communicator as different from the profile of a journalist. And we have been working, and Thomas has been part of this during many years, in this redefinition of roles, of profiles. Actually, we helped to create new master's degrees on communication for social change. The problem is that many universities have communication schools that are really journalist schools. They have only changed the name 25, 30 years ago. So we created a network in 2005 in the Philippines of those master degrees that have emphasis in communication for social change and not just journalism. They were only 15 in 2005 in the whole world. And now I think there are about 30 in 2013, including, of course, Malmo. And the work that is done here. In Europe, there's not many. I mean, apart from Malmo, I don't think there's 2 or 3 more, maybe. Huh? Yeah, not much. In Latin America, we have now we have a little bit more. There's 3 or 4 new in Colombia and Central America. But basically, Asia and Latin America were pioneers, like the College of Development Communication in the Philippines started 30 years ago, and they have they call it Communication for Development. So they have the underdegree Communication for Development, a master degree in Communication for Development, and a PhD in Communication for Development. So they have the 3 levels. And in India, for example, there's 3 or 4 which are very interesting and very old also. I visited a couple of them. And so when we try to define, in this article I wrote back in 1998, when we try to define what is this new communicator, is someone that has really the capacity to balance theory and practice, very important. Has direct experience in development programs, is very useful. I remember when I was working with UNICEF in Nigeria and I needed communicators for programs that I had there at the community level. I had 200 CVs from journalists, and of course they were useless for the work we needed to do in the field. So we ended hiring people that came from anthropology, from sociologists, other kind of profile, people basically with experience working with communities. A communicator has a social and political commitment. It's not neutral. A journalist is not neutral either, but they claim they are. There has to be some kind of long-term thinking, strategic thinking, which we journalists do not have. We are very much based on the immediate things. And it has to be capable of integrating other fields of knowledge. We are just facilitators of knowledges that are exchanged. We need to work with other disciplines, and that's very important in our work as communicators. Understanding the complexity and diversity of the reality in which we work, and thinking communication as a process, always a process of intercultural dialogue, where technology is just a tool. All these things, actually, we saw them in this research on the community film in Latin America. Even if people would not articulate this thing sometimes verbally, but through their films, through the conversations they had, it was clear that that was their way of positioning themselves in their communities. And this has to do, oh gosh, my friend.
Yes, your new friend.
Yeah. Same procedure. Well, you're good at that. So basically the thing is that 25 or 30 years ago, studies of communication, of journalism in the whole world changed their name to studies of social communication, but they didn't change the basics of the studies. You know, television, radio, press, advertising. I think it must be the only discipline where we study the instrument. It's like the doctors were studying X-ray and bisturi or whatever. I mean, I never understood that kind of division in the communication studies. It goes by the instrument, the radio, whatever. So the new name 25 years ago, but old content, the same things, always putting the technology like a carrot in front, and with a very technical mindset, in many cases despising theory, for example, despising thinking. We need to learn how to do this, but not think about why are we doing this. And that worries me a lot. It's something that I've seen master degrees in documentary film, and not that they are reflecting on documentary film, they are learning how to do documentary film. So it's a technical thing. They could just go to a technical school to do that. But some universities are on that line. In Latin America, during many years, we were ignoring our own Latin American thinkers, which were very important. We were still reading Schramm, Lerner, our friend Rogers, and they were ignoring Pasquali, Beltran, Diaz-Bordenave, and many others that already in the 60s, when Rogers and Lerner and Schramm brought out their books, we had some very good thinkers in Latin America, but since they were not translated, nobody knew about them. This is something that we did justice in the anthology, because for the first time, we translated, for example, to English Pasquali, a text, a brilliant text of 1963. And they were very few opportunities for specializing in this type of communication that is not media-oriented communication. Also, the demand has been distorted in many ways. The wrong profile is being produced by universities because organizations that deal with social change or economic change or development, when they want to hire someone, actually they hire journalists, they hire public relation people, and not people that will contribute to the sustainability of the programs and projects working with the people. So that's something that also we question very much. There's no articulation between development organizations and academia. So all these things that I'm saying now relate very much with what we find in these communities that are producing their own films. And they are doing it in such an isolated way because precisely universities are not helping them, or development organizations are not helping them. They are doing it by themselves because we don't have an environment that is favorable to that. Yeah, I can cut, it's just doors, so we can open one, two. So yeah, I will go very fast on this so we can have some questions. Sometimes we are working with the same principles or the same values, and because of words, definitions, egos, we kind of feel that we are doing a different work. There's some kind of foundational jargon in many of us. For example, I was just in Mexico last week, and we were presenting things, and a friend of us was presenting the strategic communicator because she's working in strategic communication. The other one is social engineers, Chucho Galindo, and the other one is the cyber culture agent, and I'm talking about the new communicator, and it's basically the same thing. We share the same values, but we always want to brand things and to put a stamp on things. That's a very academic thing, but basically we are doing the same things. And what is important is that context is everything. Whatever the professional profile we have, we work in a concrete space of action, and that concrete space can have many limitations because the reality is determinant. And then I will not go into this, I will just go very fast, putting side by side the two types of communication, and the one we have chosen as communicators. On one side, the vertical, persuasive, etc., communication. On the other side, we have a communication that is participatory, and that has a lot to do with horizontality, with conscientization, awareness. That's from Paulo Freire, that deals with the structural causes and not just behavioral causes, that feels that culture is an opportunity and not a barrier, that aims for collective changes with active and critical people that are agents of change and not just objects of change, and that is based in dialogue and debate and a specific diagnosis of the context and the problems. This is, I'm sorry because I think I miscalculated my presentation. It will be much longer, but I guess the paper will be distributed or something afterwards. And I'll just, maybe I'll show another clip or not even. Oh, this is wonderful, but no time for that. This is from a friend, Ricardo Ramirez, that separates those that have he says planners and searchers, and basically planners would be those that already know everything, so they go to any context and they already know what to do, and searchers are those that have doubts and that ask, interrogate and listen, and the difference between them is that ones are telling, the other ones are listening. It's a very nice book called Communication for Another Development, something like that, wrote by Ricardo Ramirez and Wendy Quarry. Okay, so basically I had 2 doors more, but I will maybe stay there. If this is a clip, we'll see it, and that will be it. You recognize that flash? Then let's go to the... Well, let's stop it there, maybe. I don't know. Yeah, because we don't have much time to the discussion, no?
I mean,
Maybe we can put it in the background without sound.
I think we can go 10 minutes because we have a 15-minute break, which is basically just to catch maybe a cup of coffee and go to the rooms.
Thank you.
Isn't that right? Yeah. So thank you very much, Alfonso, and let's open up for some comments and questions, opinions,
and
remarks.
Then we take out the sound. No, this was the other one. This is the one. And we take out the sound and no, it should come. It should come.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So who wants to start?
There isn't a...
No, it's made to start as we.
Yeah, no, that's...
Okay. No, we can have it in the background. Yeah, this is just a film where it's interesting because this indigenous group decides to go and film people in Rio de Janeiro. You see, they always been filmed, and now they decide to go and film the others. So that's why it's interesting.
I just took the volume down. Oops.
Well, anyway, is there any question or?
I have one question, but it's about the project you were describing in the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
The mic is on. And you said you were working with different organizations in the 14 countries. My question is a bit, what organizations are doing Film for Change? Which type of organizations were you working with?
No, what I said, and I showed the list, we were working through 6 researchers that did in each country the research on what were the community groups doing films on themselves, okay? And from those hundreds that they identify at the beginning, we choose 55 to do a little bit in-depth analysis, and that's what we did. Those are not organizations in the straight sense of the word. They're just community groups, most of them indigenous community groups, but also groups in like Barricada TV in the neighborhoods of Buenos Aires, or festivals, popular film festivals, but they are not really established organizations.
But even that community, didn't they have some organization or?
Well, they have their internal community.
To start the process of doing film?
Yeah, that's what is interesting. Sometimes, for example, each case is different. Each case is different, but what we have seen, for example, is that in the case, for example, in Video nas Aldeias in Brazil, 25 years ago, they gave them training and the cameras, and they have continued themselves, and they still receive some kind of support for editing or for some things, but basically they have long-term projects that no filmmaker would do, because they have projects of 2, 3, 4 years. You know, there's an interesting case, for example, in one of these groups that they were trying to film a festivity, a local festivity, and the elders didn't want to. So they had like 2 years of convincing the elders to do the festivity again, and that has been filmed. The process of convincing them has been filmed, and then at the end they make the festivity. So things like that. Each one is different, but normally it's groups of young people that get together and do it. Yeah.
I put myself on. I had a question regarding, I was struck by your point, because it's about indigenous film, and then you mentioned that the majority are from rural areas. So my question would be, how about, I mean, indigenous in the understanding of local, or how about the urban experience? Can you say anything about that? Is it much smaller, weaker, or do you just focus on the rural?
No, I mean, well, let's say that each researcher of the 6 had the assignment to choose between 3 and 5 experiences in each country, for each country. So they made their choices. We discussed it already. We had a whole set of criteria. But basically what it came out that the most interesting experiences were those by indigenous communities, rural communities, local communities, except for those that I have mentioned. For example, I mentioned Barricada TV in Buenos Aires, but in Uruguay also that there is TV Árbol, which is a small television station that deals with the environmental issues. And what they do actually is they lend the cameras to communities to do their own films. So, of course, Uruguay and Argentina don't have many Indians, so it's clear that we would look more at urban experiences. But in Peru, for example, we have both. We had experiences very much in the rural area, and experiences that are in the urban area also. So it varies from one country to another. Most of the experiences in urban areas are experiences of distribution, more than production of films. And we wanted to look at that also, because these kind of films don't have much impact in terms of number of people looking at them. Although in Brazil, what is interesting about this group, Video nas Aldeias, is that they have managed to, but after many years of working, they have managed to have a deal with the Ministry of Education, so a package of their films, I think it's 50 films from different, a broad number of communities, is distributed in I don't know, 20,000 schools in Brazil. So that kind of things, which is interesting in terms of how they are occupying some of the public space also in with their films. No?
Hi, thank you for that presentation. I'm wondering how some of the communities that you have worked with are distributing their films. I know that they're not meant to be commercially distributed, but they're sharing them with each other, and I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about how they're doing it and who they do want to see the films. Is it for young people in the community? Is it for young people in another community? Are there target audiences that they have in mind when they make a film? And I thought about this question as I was watching the first video, because there was a scene in which young people were gathered around an open-air screen watching the film.
Yeah, exactly. The first, I think the first objective is like the mirror, to see themselves. And that, in my own experience, has been incredible. I mean, people that have never seen themselves on a screen are very much, they really discover many things when they see themselves in the screen. And I think this process of filming and showing contributes to organization, to strengthening their values, to strengthening the way they communicate. But of course they all want their films also to be seen in other places, and that's what the Brazilians have managed to do, but not all the groups. There are many groups here that you will hear from them for the first time if you read the book, because their films are only made by themselves, for themselves, and maybe the nearby communities. But there are also the other cases in the cities, like TV Árbol, for example, in the current political situation of Uruguay. TV Árbol is actually airing their films in national television, which is very good. During many years they did this kind of silent work in neighborhoods and small cities of Uruguay, but now they have a lot of time in national television, so they can show their films. So every situation is very different. In Bolivia, for example, CEFREC exists for maybe 20 years. They've been doing many films on different indigenous communities in Bolivia, and now they are kind of doing the policy on audiovisual, indigenous audiovisual on television. They have enormous influence now on the Bolivian television.
Yeah, well, as always, we had about 30 to 35 students online who were absolutely amazed by the presentation. I think this was really, for the students, this was an incredibly useful resource. So they were very thankful and are looking forward to reading your paper. And I think it also created a lot of sort of positive spirit for our own ComDev course, that the students really felt reminded for why they were doing Common in the first place and their own experiences. So you already had an impact when you were talking about process. This time the process was happening online when the students started discussing among themselves. There was actually one more concrete question that many of those who have been working in communications have experienced, and I'm using my word, not the students' word, but how do you cheat funders into funding some of these community projects? So what language do you need to use that donors feel comfortable with the idea, and then you can, unroll a process and focus on the process rather than on the outputs and measurables and so on? Do you have any secrets to share?
I think, no, I don't. No, the thing is that they don't have really funding. I mean, it's like we have a great deal of experience in Latin America with community radio. If you ask me, there's about 10,000 community radio stations in Latin America. And if you ask them who funds them, each one will give a different reply, and most of them will say nobody. But they're still there and they're airing. It's something that we tried to study. I participated in 2003 or 2004 in a research study with ALER and AMARC, which are two important organizations dealing with community radio. And the book that came out is called La Práctica Inspira, Practice Inspires, and we studied 34 radio stations that are sustainable, and each case is different, because sometimes they have a small, somebody gives the equipment, somebody gives it money here, and it's the same thing in the case of these communities. If you Video en las Aldeas, the Brazilian experience, of course, is a little bit more developed, and they have managed to get some funding from different sources. But Barricada TV, for example, has to close down every once in a while because they don't have the means to buy the tapes or the batteries or the things like that. They have the space that has been given by workers on a factory that own the place. So each case is very different, but there's we didn't get into that part of funding. That's part of the second phase that we want to do. But on my experience, I can tell you that I don't know what's the language, because I don't think that is of any interest of people that are funding these things. They don't see any usefulness, and that's why when I discuss these things with people that are potential funders, what I'm telling them is this has to do with not only with culture, not only with communication as an abstract thing, this has to do with sustainability of programs and projects. And when people in the UN or any development agency understand that their projects will be more sustainable when people participate and get ownership of the programs and projects, then they understand that they may fund it because it's in their own interest. That's the only way to talk to them.
Okay, I think we'll have to unfortunately stop now, Alfonso, but thank you very much.
Thank
and
you.
hopefully the dialogue can continue. Now we're going to have just an issue of practical information. We're going to have a small break, stretch your legs, maybe this time just for brief fresh air. Then we're going to go into the groups. Group A will be here. Tobias. Group B will be here. Okay.
Group A will be in the lunchroom.
In the lunchroom.
And Group C will be in the third room.
Which is behind the lunchroom. I think the lunchroom has been... Ulrika? Wait, just one moment, yes? Okay, coffee will be inside the rooms. So don't take coffee, it's going to be in your room. So group B here, group A there, and group C in the back.